everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Veritas Forum IG Live. My name is Aurora Ling, and I'm a PhD student at Princeton studying political science with a concentration in international relations. I attended UC Berkeley as an undergrad, and I'm a journal coach for the Veritas Forum's Augustine Collective, which is a group of student-led Christian journals at universities around the country and at Oxford. So grateful to be hosting this conversation with Jemar Tisby, the author of The Color of Compromise, the president of the Witness Black Christian Collective, and the co-host of the collective's podcast called Pass the Mic. Welcome to this conversation, and for those who are unfamiliar, the Veritas Forum supports students in asking the big questions of life and building robust, pluralistic dialogue at universities. The forum introduces the life, story, and person of Jesus Christ through events like this. Jemar, thank you so much for being here. We'll start off with having you talk a little bit about yourself and how you got to research what you do.
I'll try to give the short version. I was born and raised in the Midwest. My house was not a Christian household per se, but I came to faith in high school through the ministry of a white evangelical youth group. And so a lot of my formative experiences with religion were in these contexts. And so I've always been asking questions about race and religion and race and Christianity, particularly evangelicalism. Right now, I'm a PhD student in history, so solidarity in that PhD hustle, Aurora.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm a PhD student in history, studying race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century at the University of Mississippi is where I go to school. And like you said, I'm also president of the Witness, a Black Christian Collective, and I wrote the book, The Color of Compromise, the truth about the American church's complicity and racism. So like my interest in history came from a variety of factors. Mainly, one is when I graduated college from the University of Notre Dame, go Irish, I joined Teach for America, and they placed me in the Mississippi Delta, which is where I live to this day, on the Arkansas side. And so, a lot of people want to point to the South as like, they're the real racists. You know what I'm saying? That's the racist part of the country. Reality is bigotry has no borders. The incidents that we're looking at happen in places like Minneapolis and Central Park in New York City. So it's certainly not confined to the South. What I will say is a bit different about the South is the geography and the physicality of race. And so I live in cotton country, and my commute to the university is literally through cotton fields. So it's a lot harder in that context not to think about the past, not to think about the history of race. And by the way, if any of y'all are thinking about taking a pilgrimage, like these civil rights pilgrimages or whatever, you've got to come to the Delta. Like this, it's a very different place. The way I explain to people is the way a lot of people look at Mississippi, that's the way Mississippi looks at the Delta. It's a place that seems caught back in time, but it's also a place that I have found reveals the character of the nation like no other region. So anyway, add that to your list. So being here, that turned me on to history, but also in August of 2014, a young teenager named Mike Brown was killed by a white police officer, popularized the Black Lives Matter movement. And in trying to make sense of what was going on in Ferguson, for instance, how does a predominantly white police force come to police a predominantly Black community? I found that historians often had the most helpful things to say. So that kind of started me down a road that ended me in a grad class that ended me up in grad school. So that's where I am now.
Yeah. So as you're studying racism and complicity, how do you define these two terms? And then how did you find that they were related to one another?
So I borrow a definition from Beverly Daniel Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Cafeteria? Mm-hmm. She defines racism as prejudice plus power and a system of oppression based on race. The second one is the one she uses. A system of oppression based on race is vital because it speaks to the system. A lot of people misunderstand racism as purely interpersonal and individual. It's how one person feels about someone else. And that's a problem because if that's how you diagnose the issue, then the solution is, well, I'll just be nice to people. I'll have coffee with folks from different races and ethnicities. And guess what? Some of my best friends are Black, so I can't be racist, right? That's the trope. But when you say it's a system of oppression based on race, then that gets to the idea that it operates beyond personal feelings and intentions. And so, you can look at anything from hiring practices to mass incarceration and even disparities in sentencing for different drugs and whatnot. All of that operates without any individual actor holding particular racial animus. So I like that. And the other aspect is prejudice plus power, which is the rebuttal to reverse racism. A lot of people will say, oh, well, now white people are experiencing reverse racism. Everyone can be prejudiced. Everyone can prejudge someone based on their race or their culture or whatever. But racism has this aspect of power that is not equally distributed. So the difference is a black person can act in a prejudiced way toward a white person, but that black person has no power society-wide to make that prejudice into policy, which is what's happened with white supremacy and the way white people have used race. So those are the ways I define it. And you asked about complicity. Let me say something on that real briefly. Most of the time when we think of racists, we think of the most extreme examples. So these are the people wearing white robes and hoods. They're burning crosses on lawns. They are, they're holding the rope at lynchings, right? And so those are the real racists. But when we do that, we let ourselves off the hook. Because if those are the real racists and I'm not doing those things, then I'm not part of the problem. Well, the reality is, in The Color of Compromise, I begin the book with the 16th Street church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, where 4 young girls were murdered in an act of racial terrorism at church. And the reality behind that is Birmingham had already earned the nickname Bombingham. And there was already a neighborhood in Birmingham called Dynamite Hill when this latest incident occurred. So the reality is the most egregious acts of racism can only occur within a context of compromise. So you had all these people who already had the opportunity to stand up and protest and push against the racism they were seeing, but they failed to do so, not by what they did, but what they didn't do. Not by what they said, but what they didn't say. So there's, acts of commission, there's acts of omission. And in that, all of us, a lot of white people especially, can be implicated, even if they aren't the ones planting the dynamite or firing the bullet.
Yeah. Yeah. So then, in another interview, you had said that, speaking of complicity, that the broader church in America has shied away from talking about racism. So why is it that you think, why do you think that the issue of racism and race as social justice issues are different from other social justice issues, say like sex trafficking or child labor, which the broader church in America might be more vocal about?
Yeah, there's a host of reasons too that come immediately to mind. One, racism is ubiquitous among white people. And 2, racism is advantageous to white people. It's ubiquitous and it's advantageous. Ubiquitous, what do I mean? Everybody who is white has somebody they know who is racist, oftentimes out and out racist, and will say those things. It could be a grandparent, it could be an uncle, it could be a cousin, it could be in your immediate family, right? If you look at churches, which is what I study, if a pastor or church leaders tried to root out racism in the congregation, that would cast a broad net in the congregation. Sort of corollary to that is because we have all these different definitions of racism and different gradations, it's also hard to identify, right? Like what would count as racism, let's say in a church environment? What would qualify, what would rise to the level that this needs to be confronted? I mean, we can name a few things. Thing going around. I don't know if you can still hear me. I don't know. Send me a text. I'm gonna keep. So it's you was that totally lost the thing, but this is real. Keeps cutting out.
Sorry
Can you
about
hear
that.
me?
Yes,
That's
I
all
can hear
good.
you.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
All right, is that better?
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay, great.
And hear you.
Sorry.
And you're moving.
Okay, great.
Sorry, folks, we're back.
Sorry.
So it's ubiquitous. I was just saying, why are people reticent? Oh man, it's so many reasons. It's ubiquitous. It's hard to single out. It's hard to point out. It would implicate so many people if you were really honest about racism. It would implicate so many people. And the other thing I said, what was the other thing I said? It's ubiquitous and, it's advantageous. So racism, which is a subset of white supremacy, which posits that, everything white is right. It wouldn't have such staying power if it wasn't advantageous in some way. Mm-hmm. So white people are benefiting from racism and white supremacy. They're benefiting economically, politically, socially, and culturally. So what it would require to really renounce racism is actually to renounce some of the advantages that you have in a society that considers whiteness normal and normative. You would then have to put down some of those advantages. And who's in their own self, without pressure, really willing to do that? So, I mean, we could go on and on, but those are a couple of reasons I think that people are reticent about talking about race in particular, as opposed to some different social justice issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So then in your book, you talk about how there's a difference between complicit Christianity and courageous Christianity, right? So historically speaking, what has complicit Christianity look like versus courageous Christianity? And how can we as a society get to a place where we move from complicit Christianity to courageous Christianity?
Yeah, I'm glad you singled out those poles or different descriptors, if you will. So a complicit Christianity is not countercultural. It offers very little that's different from society. It's sort of Christian in name, but not necessarily in practice, particularly around racial justice practices. And so a complicit Christianity has looked like, one example that stands out to me is in 1667, the Virginia Assembly passes a law that says baptism would not emancipate a person of Native American, African, or mixed race descent. And what's happening there, what sticks out in terms of complicity is a couple things. Number one is the intertwining of race, religion, and politics, right? So you have this political body making a law about religion based on race. So we can distinguish between those, but race, religion, and politics, if you talk about one, you're going to be talking about all of them, right? So that's one aspect. The other aspect of that 1667 law is that it's more than a century before the Declaration of Independence, is more than a century before the ratification of the Constitution. So there's no period in American history that we can go back to when America was great, when you're talking about race. And so that was a compromised or a complicit Christianity. Another example is in the 1840s, the Methodists and the Baptists split over the issue of slavery. And then in the 1860s, 1861, the Presbyterians did. So all three major denominations split over the issue of slavery, North and South. And Christians who adhered to the Southern form of Christianity advocated for slavery. Let me tease this out a little bit. So we say they split over it, but this is what gets me. In 1845, when the Southern Baptists split, here was the actual issue at hand. It was whether a missionary who was going to be commissioned to go overseas and preach the gospel, whether a missionary could hold slaves and be a Christian in good standing. So get this, right? They are commissioning this man to go preach the gospel to Black and brown people while he is owning Black people and considering them property back in the US. And so that's complicit Christianity, right? That you would defend not only the right of any particular Christian to own human being as chattel. You know, that's what chattel means, right? Chattel means property. We were considered along in the same category as a plow or a house. And you were saying not only could this man own it and be a Christian in good standing, but he could go across the ocean and preach to people who look just like the folks he owned as if he was bringing good news. So no, it's not good news when that's the complicit Christianity. Yeah. And we go on and on. Those are old examples. We go to the 1960s. We go to 1954 when they pushed back so hard. They pushed back so hard against Brown v. Board. Oh, they didn't want their little white boys and girls going to school with little black boys and girls or any other person of color. They pushed back so hard. They brought the Bible out. You know, they made every excuse that God did not want people mixing. And then you can move forward. Don't get me started on the rise of the religious right in the 1970s and onward. You can look in the present day where they have used this term critical race theory. And some far right Christians have called it the biggest threat to Christianity in America today. My Lord, while the blood of black people literally cries out from the streets, my Lord. So that's where we are. That's complicit. Courageous Christianity looks like Fannie Lou Hamer. Courageous Christianity looks like Ida B. Wells. Courageous Christianity looks like Martin Luther King Jr. Courageous Christianity looks like the historic Black church in the liberatory tradition of all people of faith who have occupied the margins and have experienced oppression. So that's what we need to move toward.
If you can speak a little bit about Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement and how, you know, because within your book, you actually a kind of dichotomy in what happened in there during the civil rights movement between complicit Christianity and courageous Christianity as well. Speak to that context.
Oh, no.
Oh, it might have.
I'm here. I'm here.
Sorry about that.
Okay. So you wanted to talk about the like the social issues as a distraction from the gospel kind of thing?
Yeah, we can talk about that.
Or the separation of you cut off when you said separation or something.
Oh yeah, so I was asking if you would be able to speak a little bit more about, historically speaking, with complicit and courageous Christianity, how did that play out during the civil rights movement?
Oh yeah, yeah. Let me give you a particular example from Presbyterians. So Southern Presbyterians have this doctrine called the spirituality of the church, which says the church's mission is spiritual in nature, and they are not to get involved in civil affairs. Well, guess what? They were very selective in the application of the spirituality of the church doctrine. And so when it came to something like prayer in schools, Bibles in schools, later on abortion, well, guess what? They're going to call the governor. They're going to get meetings with the president. They're going to lobby for change. Circle of death going around and around. I hope we are still alive. And you can hear me. Very good. Okay. I can see you moving now. Every now and again you pause, and then I just pause my answer. So they were very selective in their application of the spirituality of the church. And guess when the spirituality of the church most often applied was with racial issues. All of a sudden, those were issues that churches could not get involved in. No, we shouldn't be marching on the streets. No, we shouldn't be getting involved in voting rights for Black people. No, we shouldn't be getting involved in these direct action, nonviolent protests. Those kinds of things only bring division. That's what they're going to call you. Somebody else said that, you know, when people charge you with being divisive because you talk about racism, somebody said that's like saying that the person who told you it's raining caused it to rain. You know what I'm saying? We just stating a fact. Like, it's already raining. It's already raining racism. Us pointing it out is not it's not making you wet. It was already happening there. So in the civil rights movement, again, with the idea of complicity, you have King's letter from a Birmingham jail where he talks about the white moderate and how the silence from our friends was worse than the outright opposition of our enemies. And boy, I can resonate with that, because back in 2015, 2016, 2017, when we're protesting, when we're talking about racism and Black Lives Matter and all of that stuff, much the sort of direct opposition that was the somebody. It wasn't so much the direct opposition that was the problem. It was the silence of our friends. It was the quiet of our Christian brothers and sisters who called on the name of Christ. That's the kind of thing that King was talking about. And I'll tell you one story real quick. I used to live in Jackson, Mississippi, and they literally barred Black people from coming in and worshiping at these sort of large white churches downtown. And I talked to a guy just a couple of years ago who was a kid during that time. He was probably 9, 10, 11 years old, somewhere around there. And he remembers being in the car with his parents across the street from the church as they were about to go in, as the deacons were physically barring an interracial group of worshipers from coming in. They didn't want Black people in there. They didn't want an interracial group of people in there. And what struck me about that was I wouldn't expect a 9, 10, 11-year-old to do much, but his parents didn't do anything. That's the quintessential example. You know, you are members at this church. You see your church leaders barring this group because of racism, and you remain silent. You didn't do anything. And I'll be honest right now, if we survive that long, 50 years later, people will be looking back at the church in this moment and saying, where were you? Right. What did you do in this moment about racial justice? And so we're not so different than people who came before us. And now is the opportunity. Now is the time to do those things that you thought were way beyond the pale, way too radical. Now is the time to get involved, whatever that looks like for you.
Yeah. So then, you know, for people who are wrestling with this question of how can I get involved? You know, how can I as a Christian help what is going on? Practically and biblically, how do a place in our society of complete reconciliation? What is that reconciliation going to look like? And you know, what gives you hope to fight for that reconciliation?
Yeah, well, you know, others have said that Christianity is neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but realistic. And so that's what I appreciate about Christianity, is that it is honest about how messed up we are and can be. And so even if you look at the so-called heroes of the Bible, from Moses to David to many, many others, they were flawed people, right? And so, you know, we'll never, I don't believe, until Jesus returns, reach a perfect state of reconciliation or peace and harmony between people. But here, somebody said reconciliation can't happen because there's been no conciliation. I want to address that real quick. I understand the sentiment, but I think reconciliation is not about so much of what has been true in the past, but of what we're working toward in the future. And it's always been interesting to me that God speaks of reconciliation with human beings as reconciliation. So reconciliation is a biblical word, which is why I use it. And how can it be that we can speak of being reconciled to God, because in our lifetime, in your lifetime, we've never been at perfect peace with God because of our fallenness and our rebellion. So how is it that God speaks of reconciliation? I think because there was a time in Genesis 1 and 2 when we did have that conciliation. But I still use reconciliation because of that biblical word. But I'm not bad at people if you use conciliation. That's fine too. Anyway, let me break it down for you like this. Last chapter of the book, I talk about, it's called The Fierce Urgency of Now. That's from ML's speech in March on Washington. And basically, how can we respond to the fear urgency of now? So I break it down into an acronym that I called the ARC of racial justice, which stands for awareness, relationships, look at all of them. So number one I mean, this is not a sequential step, but just to unpack it first is awareness. That means building your knowledge. White supremacy operates according to a playbook, and we need to know how that playbook works. You need to know the history of racism. You need to listen to forums like this one to add to your knowledge base. You need to have some insight into all this stuff. And my favorite answer about raising awareness is two words: Google it. Google it. I mean, all this information is available widely. You can look at documentaries, et cetera, et cetera. So I see all this cutting out stuff. I hope that's a delay. I hope we're back on. Anyway, I'm gonna just keep talking. So we have to build our awareness, but you can't stop there. You can't just get a big head about this stuff and know the right stuff without doing something. So that comes into the relationships aspect. It's really hard to love someone you don't know, meaningful contact with. And that means, so in a Christian context, a lot of people, racial diversity, but they talk about it strictly in terms of Sunday. What can we do in Sunday morning worship? What can we do for this hour or two once a week? But real relationships require a life transformation and a disposition to where Monday through Saturday, you are living an interracial, interethnic, reconciled life. And so we have to sort of audit ourselves. Who do we know? Not just on Sunday or for a particular occasion. Who are we bringing around the table and into the conversation, and into our lives in a meaningful way relationally, because all reconciliation is relational. You have to reconcile with human beings made in the image of God. And that's where a lot of people gain their awareness. So for white people who are very, can grow up very unaware of systemic racial issues, the first time they become aware of it is because someone they knew talked to them about their reality and their experience. And they can hear that individual a lot more clearly and with a lot more acceptance than they can read a book or look at a statistic. So that relational aspect. Then finally is commitment. You see, the problem with relationships is, especially white evangelicals, they want to stop there. Again, it gets to that sort of very interpersonal, individualistic understanding of what racism is, where if I have black friends, then I'm all good. I'm not racist. I'm not part of the problem. And that's an issue because, say you go out to coffee with your friend from another race or ethnic background, that's great. But guess what? It's not going to do a thing about mass incarceration. Say you're at a church and y'all do a pulpit swap and you got different choirs together and it's all great and look, we're all together. Guess what? That's not going to do a thing about the racial wealth gap. So commitment talks about policy. Commitment talks about the fact that racist policies are embedded in the way we do. Now, is that if you are looking at this present moment, these past 2 or 3 weeks especially, and you are not rethinking how you vote, who you vote for, and what policies you support, please step to the side. We're on this racial justice journey and you are in the way because you don't realize why policies are so important. Racism, go back to 1667. Guess what? They made a policy that would operate independent of any individual's motivations. They made a policy about back then. We're still making policies like that today. Okay. So if you're not on this, hey, we got to change. Hey, one more thing. If we talk about voting, we can't wait till November. We got to work now on things like mail-in ballots. We got to work now on things like protecting people who have been enfranchised, particularly Black people, the formerly incarcerated, et cetera, because they are working now to limit who can vote and how they can vote. And then we can get to November and it won't matter what goes down.